So I'm doing a history project for my history class in school, and I am doing it on the late British Empire. So, to understand the late British Empire, we have to understand the end of the early British Empire. Britain had a major problem at the end of the American Revolution. The rowdy Americans had just left the tea-sipping, civilized British club, and they had shipped convicts to the American colonies earlier as a form of penal transportation. It was easy, but now they couldn't. So they decided that a recently found continent named New Holland would do the job. And then they decided to rename it to Australia. Captain Cook landed at Botany Bay in 1770. Called the area he landed in New South Wales, and claimed it for Britain, and the first convicts arrived in 1788. After this, King George III got into a spat with a certain Napoleon Bonaparte, and started a war called the Napoleonic War, which Britain won. In 1815, Britain got Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, and other French territories from France. They also got the Cape Colony from the Netherlands. More on that later. Britain also had the East India Company, which took control of much of present-day India. They used to make tea and opium. We'll also get back to this. Britain used to trade with China for tea because they loved tea, but there was a huge deficit due to China only insisting on pure silver for tea. Britain had failed talks with China, and then they decided that they had a very big brain plan to stop this. What they would do is basically they would make opium in their Indian colonies. They would go and sell it to China for Chinese silver. They would take that Chinese silver and sell it to China for tea. And China went like, hey dude, you're wrecking our country with all this opium. Can you stop? Britain went like, we're going to war. And in 1842, Britain won the first Opium War. China ceded Hong Kong Island, and Britain got more land around Hong Kong later in time. Back in India, Britain was in some hot water. There were rumors that the British were greasing cartridges that held gunpowder. For some context, to load a pistol in that time, you had to bite off a cartridge that held gunpowder. Well, you had to grease it with some oil. What they would do, there were rumors that the British greased it with cow fat and pig fat, and that would be offensive to both Hindus and Muslims because in their cultures you can't eat cows and pigs, respectively, pork and beef. Sepoys who were Indian soldiers that fought for the British had to bite them off. And that rumor spread around, and it catalyzed into widespread mutinies that led to the Indian Rebellion in 1857. Now, this isn't the only thing that started the rebellion. Actually, there was a thing called the Doctrine of Lapse, which many Indian rulers hated, and it caused a lot of tension. What it did was, it would say that if an Indian prince had no heir upon the time of his death, all his kingdom or all his land would be transferred to the British East India Company. And obviously this was very unpopular. This led to a lot of tension. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was very brutal, and sepoys had control of Delhi, but they failed because mainly some Indian princely states were helping the British. After this rebellion, the British consolidated India, and they basically took over the whole Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and except Goa because that was Portuguese, and they were friends with the Portuguese. And Queen Victoria got crowned Empress of India. This means that India was now a part of the British Crown. Britain also had a rivalry with Russia. They went into Afghanistan, but got kicked out of Afghanistan. They also went to war in Crimea alongside France and the Ottoman Empire, and won that war. And around this time, New Zealand came into the eyes of the British. The local Maori population that lived there decided that they wanted to trade with the British at first because they liked it, but then they realized the British were planning to stay, and they started a war. And the British won that war. And let's go back to the Cape Colony. Back in the Cape Colony, the Boers didn't like the British, so they left. They formed border republics like the Orange Free State and Transvaal. The British were like, okay, we'll leave them alone until diamonds were found there. Now, diamonds equal money, and who loves money? The British. So they decided that they wanted the Boer republics. The Boers were like, no, you're not going to take our land. Britain's like, we're going to war. And they won that war. They won the Boer Wars. And it was very hard for the British. The Boers used guerrilla tactics, but the British used cruel tactics like forcing Boer populations into concentration camps. But they soon won that war and consolidated, and they got the control over the Boer republics. But they compromised with the Boers. They allowed them to be dominant and also not to allow Africans to have voting rights. Most Africans couldn't vote. And this would play into apartheid. The Berlin Conference was there so that there would be a peaceful division of Africa between European powers, like splitting a cake peacefully. They treated Africa like that. Britain and France got the most land after this, and after this, there were only two independent African countries, Liberia and Ethiopia. And in 1914, the British got into a spat with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and it won that spat. The spat is known as World War I. The British took several German and Ottoman territories and reached its height in the 1920s. It had the most territory at this time. But with everything, like a roller coaster, whatever goes up must come down. In 1939, Britain got into a war with Nazi Germany after they invaded Poland. And Germany had a crushing defeat over France, and they seemed unstoppable. Britain was on the brink of collapse. They took Lend-Lease from America, were almost bankrupt. A 4.3 billion loan in 1946, which is about 56 billion in 2020 US dollars, was given by America to Britain to save it from utter financial collapse. Britain finished paying this loan in 2006. 2006. That's when some teenagers were born. at the time of recording. Britain could not afford to maintain its huge empire anymore. It just wasn't financially viable. So in India, a party that advocated for Indian independence, the Indian National Congress, or the INC, got into power, and it advocated for Indian independence. So in 1947, they hastily drew up a map splitting British India into two countries, Pakistan and India. They were Muslim majority and Hindu majority countries respectively. And there was a violent partition called the Partition of India, and many people were trying to get to their own side of the border, but there was a lot of violence. After World War II, Britain slowly let go of its colonies in Africa. But there was a very violent uprising in Kenya called the Mau Mau Uprising. It's spelled Mau. They quashed that rebellion, but it was very violent, and in 1963, they let go of Kenya. It also gave independence to its dominions, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And in 1997, the British Empire had the sun set on the British Empire. Finally, it set on an empire where the sun never set. When Hong Kong was returned to China. The British Empire had a huge impact on the modern world. First, some countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and others have Queen Elizabeth II as their queen. She is a British monarch. She is also the head of the Commonwealth of Nations, which is a bunch of former British colonies. Britain also influenced the lifestyle, the way of government, and the society drive on in many of her former colonies. I have a primary source from Sir Frederick Lugard. He was the governor of Hong Kong and the governor of Nigeria in 1893, and this is a part taken from the statement. He says, "To allow other nations to develop new fields and to refuse to do so ourselves is the more deplorable, and it is to go backward." This is how the British Empire started out. They stopped France from getting colonies and also pushed ahead with getting colonies itself. They weakened France with the Napoleonic Wars and took French colonies and weakened France. Yeah. They pushed ahead with getting colonies, and this snowballed into the imperial power it is known as today. Thank you for watching my history project video. Bye.